Okay, well, with that, then I'll call the meeting to order, and then we'll go right into roll call. Ms. Kelly,
Chair Lee,
I'm here from Michigan.
Vice Chair Abrams absent, Secretary Weish,
I'm here.
Commissioner Mills,
I'm here.
Commissioner Hammerschmidt noted absent, Councilmember Dish noted will be late. Commissioner Weatherby,
Here.
Commissioner Clark,
Yeah.
Commissioner Adams.
Here.
I don't think I normally do roll call for working sessions. Usually I just make a note of who's on my list, and Councilmember Dish just joined. So for the future, we probably don't need to do it, but let our last expected member in.
Cool. Yep, that sounds good. I do think, though, that we're going to go to public comment as our second agenda item. So persons may speak for 3 minutes about any item. Do we have any callers? I could
We have
to the whole thing about *9 and all that, but
there are 3 people who all appear to have joined by Zoom, not by phone, and no hands are raised.
okay, sounds good. And then anybody by caller, can we see that? I don't know if we can.
I would be able to see if someone joined by phone because it would show up as a phone number, and there's no one who joined in that way.
Okay, got it. Sounds good. Thank you. Well, with that, then I'll close public comment and we'll head on to our presenter for the evening. Hi, Kayla. Welcome.
Hello. Thanks for having me. I'm pleased to be here. Would you like me to jump right in? Is that okay?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Thanks.
Kayla, could you please do a brief self-introduction since we do have people
New
from the public?
Sure.
Yes.
Mix Kelly, really quickly, I actually just noted that Diane, one of our attendees, raised her hands, and I'm wondering if we could maybe make a quick second for her just before we jump into it. So I'll reopen public comment if that's okay.
Sure thing. Give me 1 second to pull my clock back up.
Right. Thank you, Kayla. Sorry.
No problem.
Yeah.
Diane, you have permission to address the Planning Commission.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I'm calling in about the planning meeting intent to talk about 2525 Ann Arbor Saline Road. Is that open for discussion?
I
emailed. I know that the neighborhood I live in has multiple people opposed to the rezoning to change it from office to residential for a 5-story apartment complex. Indicated that we're supposed to come to this meeting when you announced that the agenda was changing. I know other people called in. This neighborhood, which is right across the street from Whole Foods, many of us are opposed to putting an apartment complex on a road that cannot support more traffic. Last year, we had a car go into a sinkhole. And how will the changes with that many apartment complexes be corrected to ensure that we all can share the road? Plus school housing, with all the apartment complexes going in at Briarwood Mall and within a mile or 2 of that location. Do we need more businesses or do we need more apartments?
Does that conclude your comments?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. I believe that's, I'll just check to see if anybody else. Council Member Dish.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, could we just clarify for the benefit of this caller that that item was not on tonight's meeting agenda? I think
Yes.
there's been
Yeah.
a lot of confusion in the community about that because the community meeting was just held and people felt that we would be talking about it tonight. And I think this caller indicated she thought there had been a change to the agenda that might have taken that off. So
Yes. Thank you.
can
Yeah.
you, yes, okay, good.
No, thank you. Yeah, we're not reviewing that item tonight. I think it's just a capital improvements prioritization plan, or is that correct?
So I can share for the benefit of that caller and all commission that 2271 South State was supposed to be on tonight's agenda for a pre-PUD submission conference. And that was withdrawn by the petitioner because they were not yet ready to present their concept. So we left the other agenda item, which is Kayla's item 2525 Ann Arbor Saline Road. As the council member stated, I believe that they requested labels in the middle of last month to send out their citizen participation meeting. And so it sounds like that was recently held. I don't have the date right in front of me. But they have not yet formally submitted a project with the city. So we don't have anything beyond a concept and the exchange of labels for their intent to proceed for that project. That's the status of that.
Gotcha. Thank you, Ms. Kelly, for the clarification. With that, let's move on to Ms. Coleman's presentation. Hi, Kayla.
Hello. Thank you, Chair and Commission, for having me this evening. My name is Kayla Coleman. I'm the Capital Projects Asset Manager here at the City of Ann Arbor in the Systems Planning Unit. So my role is a primary part of my role is to prepare the capital improvements plan, and this Planning Commission is the decision-making body for approval of that plan. And so I'm here tonight to talk a bit about the scoring process for capital projects. Typically, you've seen me come in the fall or December or even January for the plan adoption, but we've talked over the last couple of years about doing some updates to our scoring measures and how capital projects are evaluated. So as this is sort of the off season of CIP planning, this is a good time, works out well for me to come and share some more detail and share some information about work that staff are pursuing right now, and to get some input from commissioners that could help guide this process. So with that, let me share my screen. Please stop me if you aren't seeing my slides, but I think you should be. And I will get these controls moved out of my way. And then
Yes, we can see your slides, Kayla.
Okay.
Just confirming.
Great, thank you. All right, so many of you have seen this graphic before about capital improvement planning process, but I'm gonna, for the benefit of any members of the public following along or any new commissioners, I do wanna briefly overview what it all is entailed in the CIP process, and then talk a little more about where we'll focus tonight. So capital improvement planning includes a couple of major steps that are identifying potential projects, so thinking about project needs and scopes, prioritizing projects based on what we refer to as strategic value, and I'm going to talk a little more in some later slides about what we mean by that, and then programming projects, considering the prioritization rank of that value, the budget, considering also budget estimates and funding sources and funding availability, thinking also about staff capacity and project coordination. So with all of those different things to consider, staff put together a proposed capital improvements plan and then bring that forward to this commission, Planning Commission, as the decision maker. And ultimately what Planning Commission is looking for is whether or not this proposed CIP aligns with the priorities that are identified in the city's comprehensive plans. So thinking about whether or not we're achieving those goals that we've set out to achieve, and doing this work in this capital work in a way that brings the most value to achieve the progress on those plans. And then for another piece of the puzzle and how this fits into the bigger picture, the capital improvement plan is what informs the city's capital budget. And city council makes the decisions on budget approval, and that's where dollars actually get allocated for project implementation. So we'll definitely have plenty of time for questions at the end, but just hopefully that helps to give an overview of the process, where we're going to focus. I am going to continue stepping through each of these steps in more detail in the following slides, but we're really focusing around project prioritization. We have a defined process for that we've been using for many, many years. And while we're not overhauling that process right now, we are looking at what are those scoring measures. Are the measures that we're currently using working well, or can we make improvement? And that's our focus for this discussion. So also just in context for what all goes into developing the capital improvements plan, it's a fairly involved process. During those initial steps of project identification, prioritization, and programming, those steps include over 30 meetings, including more than 50 different staff across the organization. That totals to more than 75 hours of meeting time. And I'm not talking staff time there either. So each of those meetings may have either a couple of staff, a half a dozen staff, or even a dozen included in some of these larger asset groups where we're talking about more projects and more of our city assets. That takes place primarily in September and October. And these statistics that I'm pulling right now are what I have planned for this fall's CIP process. I won't get into the detail here, but as many of you are familiar, we do what's called a full plan update every other year. This year will be one of those full plan updates. And then in the off years, it's a modification, which is a much more abbreviated process and fewer meetings, less staff commitment. And that's part of the reason why we use that model, is that it makes it a little more manageable for staff to keep up with and to have the capacity to put this all together. We have 14 asset groups. So asset groups are the different, where the project areas, similar types of projects are grouped together. So things like street projects would be one asset group, water projects, sanitary sewer projects, airport projects, parking projects. These are just some examples. And that includes in total nearly 500 projects in the current 6-year planning cycle. And that's over $1 billion worth of funding that would be needed within that 6-year period, and 50 or more potential funding sources. And by funding sources, these include different millages that the city has. This includes utility funds, like we have a water fund, a sanitary sewer fund, stormwater, et cetera. We have grant funding coming in. So many different sources that we're balancing and evaluating as potential ways to fund the work that needs to get done. So again, this is to give you context and to give you an idea of the work that goes into this, the thought, the involvement, and how we get to that plan when we bring it to this commission for consideration. So again, we identify projects. Lots of projects get proposed. The first step is think broadly, think about all of the needs, consider the condition of our assets, consider maintenance history, think about staff knowledge, where have staff seen needs for asset improvements, or the condition needs repair. We also refer to city planning documents as a source for project identification. There are other prioritization models that fit in and are paired with the CIP process. And of course, community input as well. Projects are sometimes identified through outreach from individual residents, individual community members, also through the engagement that happens in our broader planning efforts. Those also can be sources of project identification. So through all these means, we get a lengthy list of potential projects. And then here's our focus today about scoring and assessing strategic value. So in order to do this, each asset group has a set of defined strategic priorities, is what we're what they're referred to as the strategic priorities and the strategic objectives to meet those priorities. And so the example here on the slide is showing you the active transportation strategic value scorecard. And those priorities are defined as physical safety, regulatory and policy compliance, access and mobility, funding, and coordination with other projects and agencies. And some of these, at least access and mobility, has defined objectives beneath it, and some of the other priorities do not. But for each of these, the goal here in evaluating strategic or measuring the strategic value of each project is to try to determine how well that project will achieve community goals. So we want to define these scorecards in a way that are reflective of the goals of this community and this organization. And that will allow us to then compare one project to another, looking at its overall value. What value do we expect one project to bring compared to another project? And then that would inform us to schedule the projects earlier that will bring greater value. So that's the theory behind it. And then you can see a next step after we've identified these priorities, these objectives. The numbers in the bubble with the different percentages are the weights. Those are the weights that are allocated to each of those priorities, but it's not defined arbitrarily. The method that's used is called pairwise comparison, and it's meant to take some of that potential bias out of it so that we don't walk into this and just say, okay, physical safety is the most important thing, that's got to have the greatest weight. That does turn out to be the case here. You see 31% for physical safety, it's weighted the highest, but that was determined after a pairwise comparison process where we looked at each priority in comparison to each other, each objective in comparison to each other, and use these relative comparison scales to think about which one is most important for the city of Ann Arbor to invest in right now. Projects that enhance safety or projects that provide a great amount of funding benefit or have secured funding, or projects that coordinate with other agencies. So we've made those comparisons, we've established weight. The next step is to define how we will measure each project to describe the definitions along the scoring continuum that will be used to assess each project. So for physical safety, we have defined whether we're looking for whether or not the project is going to make minor improvements to transportation safety, or is that project going to have a significant impact, or is the project driven entirely by transportation safety needs? And then on a couple of the notches along the continuum, you also see reference to whether the project is a tier 2 improvement in the defined transportation safety plan or a tier 1 improvement. So there's some criteria, scoring criteria, that are more objective. We can look at the map in the transportation plan, the Vision Zero plan. We can see whether or not this project is part of that tier 1 or tier 2 corridors. And that gives us a very clear answer of where we should drop the sliding bar when we're scoring a project. But other times it's not as black and white. We rely on staff discussions and conversation about what is expected to be included within a project to assess whether or not we think that's having a minor impact or a significant impact, or really if safety is at the root of why we're doing the project. And we look to be consistent across similar types of projects. So we may look at all the sidewalk projects together and say, okay, generally we think that sidewalk improvements at least make a minor improvement to safety. But then looking on a case-by-case basis, is there other data available that would tell us that a sidewalk in a certain area brings even greater safety, potential safety improvements? And so we can customize the score per each project area, looking at them individually. And so that's an example, just talking in more detail of how we would score on that one objective. I won't talk through all of them in such detail to keep us moving, but you get the idea of how this scoring process works. We use those high, medium, and low desirability definitions to help us measure the impact that an individual project is expected to make. And then ultimately, we this produces a rank ordered list of all of our projects and their comparative overall benefit. So I'm going to review some of the steps that go into the CIP process. So again, we've talked about identifying potential projects. Lots of potential projects get identified. We then score and prioritize those. So using those scoring criteria that we just talked about, that gives us a prioritization rank. And that goes from the highest strategic value to the lowest. But we're not able to use to always use that complete list of projects as produced from top to bottom. There are other constraints we have to think about. So sometimes the project costs and the revenue forecast come into play. Staff and contractor capacity can come into play and may impact the number of projects we're able to pursue in a particular year of our capital plan. And then there are other external pressures to think about as well. Project coordination is one we talk a lot about. The most straightforward example that we always use is road resurfacing and an underground utility project. We want to maximize our efficiency. We want to take advantage of the opportunity to not just repair the road surface, but to repair and improve the infrastructure that's underground if it's needed. So that project coordination can mean that if a road condition puts it at a very high strategic value and it appears that that project should come very soon, but if the underground utilities rank a little lower, they're still needed, but they're not at the very top of the list, then there may need to be some shuffling where in order to get those projects in the same year of the capital plan, the street may wait a little longer or the underground utility may come a little sooner, and then we can maximize efficiency and do those together, because we never want to lay down fresh pavement and then come back through shortly after to make an improvement on the underground utilities. There are also competing policy priorities that may come into play. So we've got lots to think about, lots of goals as defined in different comprehensive plans, different council policy that may be set, and we've got to balance all of this and come up with a proposed plan that we can bring forward to Planning Commission. So all of this is sort of to try to help paint the picture of how that plan is developed, how the scoring process helps us, but it doesn't give us a final verdict of we can't take that rank order as is. We do have to have conversations among staff and think about these other aspects and other factors that come into play. So this next couple of slides, and I'm in my last couple of slides here, but I want to talk about the work that we're doing right now. As I mentioned, we're in the off season. We're able to focus in on these scoring updates. And part of that is specifically looking at equity and sustainability. So these are values that are reflected in some way in many of our asset group scoring measures currently, but a lot has happened since the last time these scoring measures were established. So we've got an Office of Organizational Equity that was established in 2022. The A20 plan was adopted in June of 2020, and the Office of Sustainability, it existed prior to 2020, but it's continued to grow. And many new hires have come in with new perspectives, new ideas that can help bring more people to the table thinking about the best ways to measure sustainability, to measure equity. So we're taking this opportunity now to look specifically at those important values and see how they're reflected in the asset groups now and make some proposals about how they could be improved upon. We're looking at those values across all asset groups. We're also going to look at the rest of the scoring criteria holistically for each asset group. You can see that there are some groups with stars next to them. We adopted a new CIP software called Alivant in 2020. And when we did that, those groups went through a process to update their scoring criteria. And the other 8 asset groups did not get scoring updates. They continued to use a more historic scoring process that had been around for a couple of decades. So they're definitely due for a fresh look. We're going to look at all of those scoring criteria, and that will make some adjustments and hopefully improve the way we're selecting projects. We'll then rescore all of those existing projects using new criteria. So that'll be a major effort. As I said, we've got over 400, really closer to 500 existing projects. So we'll be looking at incorporating these new scoring measures. And here's a look at some of the work so far. So equity is currently measured in different asset groups primarily by these two criteria, either percentage of households in poverty within the project location, or the project's ability, or I should say or the ability to improve accessibility, considering ADA access and whether the project provides limited or full universal access. So we've had some discussions with staff today. We are working through this process actively. I'm coming to you as we are digging into it. And I don't have something to present to you of what we've come up with yet, but what I can tell you about discussions to date is that we're looking at the Washtenaw County Opportunity Index, the Vision Zero Transportation Equity Needs Map. So trying to think about these tools that already exist and how they could be used to leverage those to measure equity for particular projects. Also looking broadly at how does a project resolve an inequity gap? So perhaps there's a historic inequity. Does this project contribute towards resolving that, or does it further exacerbate an equity issue? Also considering housing supply and the desirability to live in Ann Arbor. We know that housing is an important topic for this community. It's an important focus of the comprehensive transportation plan. So we're considering whether or not that should be leveraged in the equity assessment for a particular project, or is that better represented more holistically as more generally, I guess, as part of the inequity gap discussion. And also looking at accessibility. So we had accessibility reflected in a few asset groups previously, but looking more broadly at how that applies across all of them. For sustainability, the current scoring criteria have used sustainability framework goals. There are some that use A20 goals, and then there are other references that don't name necessarily a certain policy document. It doesn't name the framework or A20, but it references protection of natural systems, whether or not a project expands transportation options through active transportation and transit, whether a project reduces energy load, adds new trees, or reduces flooding. So these are all criteria that show up in some way across the asset groups. And so far, the discussion in the sustainability teams has really focused around reflecting A20. So that being our primary guiding document for sustainability and wanting to align how we score projects with the way that the A20 strategies are represented. So with that, I'd love to open it up for questions and discussion. And here are some ideas about areas that the Planning Commission may want to provide input that we would certainly be very welcome and thankful for. So we're thinking about CIP scoring and how it aligns with equity, sustainability, affordability, and the work that the comprehensive plan is doing. So if you have ideas around that, that's really helpful. If you know of tools or resources that could help measure sustainability and equity, that's very helpful. We mentioned a couple already, but please share with us your background, your knowledge and expertise. And then any other general feedback that staff should be thinking about as we're moving through this process for CIP scoring, all of that is helpful. I'll return to these prompts, but the last thing I want to say is just this final overlook again at this CIP planning overview and then timeframes, just in terms of what you can expect for the future. Remember that I'll be back at some point in the fall. That's when we do the CIP discussion and the plan adoption discussion. But before then, we'll keep you informed certainly of how the scoring discussions play out, and make sure that that the communications are shared of what these teams develop. But let me end with this slide, or I can end my screen share too if that's easier, and I'll turn it over back to you, Chair Lee, for discussion with the commission.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ms. Coleman. Commissioner Adams.
Yeah, thanks, Kayla, for the presentation. It was really great. And I apologize if you covered this, but one of the questions I had when you were talking about sidewalk gap projects is why we have a scoring. My understanding is that we have a separate scoring mechanism for those projects. They also have a dedicated revenue stream. So it's not obvious to me why they would be included in your, why you would rescore them or reweight them relative to other, once they've already been scored, in other words, and they have a dedicated revenue stream that's earmarked, it feels like they ought to just be passed through, right? Or they ought to be excluded from, not from the plan, but inserted into the plan in order to whatever scoring the sidewalk gap scoring metrics would demand that they be scored by, instead of being re-racked or re-weighted through a different process. Did you cover that, or did I miss something or misinterpret it?
No, we didn't. We did not talk about that explicitly. And it's funny you say that, because as we've been having these discussions, oh, my camera's not going to focus on it. But what I have a printout of is the sidewalk gap prioritization scoring, what their scoring system uses. And I don't know if it shows up here. I thought this slide may help us. Yeah, it does show up in one of these priorities. And I don't know offhand which one it is, where a certain number of points are allocated to the sidewalk project based on how it scores in the sidewalk gap prioritization process. And I think that your point is that there's some redundancy for sure in scoring it through this sidewalk gap system and then scoring it in the CIP active transportation. And I think that that's something that the scoring teams will look at in more detail. It's come up already in some of the early discussions. One thing to take into consideration is that we don't have a sidewalk asset group. It's the active transportation asset group. And so that includes many sidewalk projects, but it includes other cycle track, or it could include bike parking, I think is one of them. There's like maybe some people-friendly streets sorts of projects. There's other things in that asset group. So there's a need to define a broader scorecard of how we would measure active transportation. But I think your point, perhaps your point, and something the team can consider is, for those sidewalk projects, should they be exempted from this? So yes, we need to define these for other active transportation projects that are not sidewalks, but could we say that that sidewalk prioritization system is sufficient to capture all of the priorities that need to be considered, or all of the values that need to be considered? And I think it's a great point. I don't have an answer other than it's come up in early discussions, and I know the team will look at that as we
Yeah, I mean, and I would just tack onto that. I mean, I think it's sort of worse than redundancy, right? It's policy judgments that are in tension and in conflict with each other. So I can't remember if the sidewalk gap scoring came through council or not, or whether it was city administrator led. But regardless, somebody sat down and said, this is the metrics by which we're going to evaluate how we score a sidewalk project and fund it and prioritize it. And then if that's true, and then we're going to then take that sausage and put it into another sausage making process and turn it into something else, we're actually turning that policy judgment on its head. We're taking a prioritization scheme that somebody thought was the right process, and we're changing it. And I think it feels like they either need to be combined, merged together in a way that's coherent, or we ought to just abandon the sidewalk scoring project that we've been using. And I'll give you an example. There's a sidewalk up on Sunset that was a high scoring project 4 years ago. It got delayed, and I've been keeping an eye on it in the capital plan, and it's been slipping, right? And if a project was scored high at one time through the sidewalk gap project and it keeps slipping in the capital plan, something's amiss, right? Because again, it would be different if the funding mechanism, if the funding was being shared amongst all the priorities, then you'd have to weight it against these other projects. But the funding stream is dedicated. So it got a high score at one point and it keeps moving, right? And it should have been done years ago. So that prompted me to ask. And it's just something to keep an eye on, because it does feel like we're fighting each other a little bit on this one.
Absolutely. I'll say one comment just to keep in mind on, like, with the Sunset sidewalk as an example, that score is very high, both through the sidewalk gap prioritization and the CIP prioritization. And it was programmed and it moved ahead, and community engagement began, and it was the community pushback that resulted in that not moving forward to implementation. So it wasn't a difference in outcome in the two scoring processes. I only know because I was in the community engagement role at the time to help with leading that engagement effort. That's sort of gets more at external pressures more than a difference in the prioritization systems. But I absolutely, to your point about the duplication and the conflict, not just redundancy, but true conflict to have two different systems, absolutely. It'll be something to be explored as we look at these updates. There's no need to duplicate effort, and certainly no need to put two different scoring systems in conflict with each other.
Also, just to jump in, I think that our dedicated funding stream is insufficient for all of the possible CIP projects in that category. So they're ranked and identified because there could be opportunity projects that, for example, I'm just spitballing, Kayla, you can tell me if this is real or not, but if a sidewalk gap could be addressed through another and combined through another road project or infrastructure project by that we might already be tearing up some nearby right of way, and it could be added on as a scope item,
Yeah.
then it's good to know that. And sometimes those things are embedded in scoring criteria to find those opportunities to combine.
Mm-hmm. There is some of that. You're right, Ms. Kelly, that the opportunity to gain efficiency and to minimize neighborhood disruption by doing not just a sidewalk, but maybe the street and the utility work together is all considered. But could that be reflected just in the sidewalk prioritization system itself? Perhaps. I think Ms. Kelly brings up a really great point, and it's something that we can, again, look at holistically with this asset team.
Thank you, Commissioner Adams, for the good comment there. And then Commissioner White.
Hi, Kayla. Thanks so much for coming back and talking with us about the CIP. I think I'll start with a question, and then I have an observation, and then that might lead to another question. So I think the question is, I'll start with the observation. So I observed that plat between Washtenaw and Huron River Drive got repaved, restriped, a bike infrastructure was put in. And then development commenced at Viridian and at the Avalon site, which has another name, and it's not coming to the forefront of my head right away. And then they tore up the road again because they had to upgrade the water utility that was there. And as you were walking us through this slide, you sort of specifically said, we want to avoid taking a capital improvement to, for instance, a roadway, and then coming back and updating the facility underground, which then, sort of negates that work. And I wonder, I think the question is there any coordination between the CIP and the development that is happening? Because I know that development doesn't always happen on schedule. So something may get greenlit in the CIP, but a developer is coming, and because the Grove, that's what it's called, Viridian and the Grove, those two developments are coming. They've decided that the capacity there has to be upgraded. And this sort of ties in somewhat tangentially to our economic development initiatives that are currently happening with council, where developers are asked to bring the utility up to the highest possible use, which is something that council is going to consider maybe changing. And so just for my information, and maybe even for the public's, is there coordination across the CIP with this kind of development schedule so that we don't take a road, re-asphalt it, tear it all up, and then put cement down with the asphalt, and so now the road's in these sort of jagged way? Hopefully that all came through. Yeah. Okay.
Yes,
okay.
That absolutely makes sense. And so what I will say is that part of I had the graphic, sorry, I stopped my screen share so I could see everyone's face a little more, but the graphic that talked about there being over 50 staff involved in the process. And part of that are staff that are involved with development process, staff from the planning department, but also the private development team and other engineering staff that may be in conversations about site plan proposals. So there's a broad representation of different staff that are involved in the CIP process who may have knowledge of a private development project that's been put forward. And if they do, that often does get brought up. If they've got knowledge of it, they're going to bring it up in the conversation as we talk through each project individually. And we will avoid scheduling a capital improvement if we can delay it until a development is going to happen and coordinate that work, then we seek those opportunities. But there are certainly times when work goes ahead through the CIP when the city is either not aware of a private development project, or the private development may have appeared to have been delayed and had stalled out and then resurfaces unexpectedly. I'm not particularly familiar with what happened out at Platt and with the Viridian and Gross. I can't speak to that one as to what happened there. I don't know if there was like a more pressing need to move that striping ahead sooner. Do you know by chance if it was resurfaced and
No.
striped, or just
Yeah,
striped?
it was resurfaced, striped,
Okay.
and they did
And then cut into
all the driveways because my church is there, so we got a
Okay.
new driveway, a north and south one, and then about 2 months ago they tore everything up right in front of the driveway and put in a bigger water utility, and then they shut off the water for the whole neighborhood, and then they put it all back, but obviously they didn't put back asphalt, they put back cement. So the road, it's just like, oh, wow, that seemed like a lot of money that went before, and now there's more money. And maybe the developer paid for it, and the city is like, this is the way that we get this higher cost utility. But looking at the process from the vantage point that I'm looking at, it feels sort of out of sync in some ways. So I just want to know how that worked.
Yeah, well, I think the way that it's working is like through those robust staff discussions, having lots of people involved that are in different facets of the organization, involved in private development, involved in utility conversations. The goal is that that information comes up to the surface and that we can coordinate so that we are not cutting into freshly paved streets. That's certainly the goal. And it sounds like this is an example where that didn't play out. I do feel pretty certain that if a developer if the cut is happening for a developer to do an upsize to serve their development, that they are bearing the cost of that work. So I think, and I hope, and I can certainly follow up to confirm that that isn't a duplicate expense out of city dollars. But still, it doesn't change the fact that we then have fresh pavement cut into, which isn't good for the life, not only the aesthetic or the feel of the road, but it's not good for the lifespan of the pavement either. So certainly something that we try to avoid.
And then an observation, I was out biking today. I was in the sort of Longshore Drive neighborhood and down by the Argo Cascade. And we just, thanks Commissioner Dish, we just had a developer who is going to do a development on Longshore Drive. And one of the things that it got me thinking about as I was biking through the neighborhood were multiple things. One, there's not a sidewalk that comes all the way down Longshore Drive to get to the Cascade. They're going to be doing a lot of development down that road. Then as you go through the neighborhood, there's not parking permitted on Saturday, Sunday, and holidays from April to October, September. Commissioner Dish, you can correct me. I think this is your area, so you might know it more direct. And then it got me thinking about accessibility and transportation. So we, as far as I know, we don't have a transit connection that goes straight to the Argo Cascade. And then with the parking being restricted and there being no publicly accessible sidewalks, like there's all this intersection, and I don't know, like in some ways you hear me sort of grappling at the table over the last 3 years or so that we've had this conversation about, like, who do we highlight these things to? Is it a policy thing where we're reaching out to our council representatives to say, hey, did someone think about this? This development's coming, it's going to shut down this road. You can't park on the streets that are accessible, and there's no public transportation. And are we aware of the accessibility for those who have mobility issues to get to sort of this treasure in the city? And how then does that come into our planning for the city? So at a larger level, is there conversation around these key sites being accessible, like the Argo Cascade, like the new park that's going to go in, Southeast Park, Bicentennial Park, I think is what it's called. And how are we thinking about that to make those sites accessible to folks through public transportation, and sort of hitting our values of reducing vehicular miles traveled? So like, who sits at the apex of all of that so that it's not just atomized in the departments who have the direct sight or visibility to it? So someone knows about the sidewalk, someone knows about transportation, someone knows about accessibility, and then there's the capital plan that says, hey, what do we want to do in concert with the comprehensive plan for the city? And then who shepherds that to make sure that they all fall in line? Like, does that question make sense?
Sort of. Let me respond, and then we can go back, we can clarify better, because I think what comes to mind to me is that comprehensive group of 50 or more different staff, there's not an answer that's one person that does this, that it's having all those voices around the table to bring up, having transportation engineering staff, transportation planning staff, representatives from the ride who are involved in the process. When we're talking about capital projects and the impacts of a capital project, then I think a lot of those like transportation impacts would come up in those discussions. There's also a lot of thought that goes into like detour routes and ensuring, working to do a better job of maintaining accessibility for all modes of travel, not just a car detour route. I mean, this is sort of outside of capital planning, but more about how work happens within the public right of way. And that's governed by a document that's called the Public Services Standards and Specifications. It's a lengthy 800-page document that we had the pleasure of publishing an update to this January. So that's what I worked on outside of CIP season. So anyway, the point is there's a lot of guidance that goes on to how work happens in the public right of way, and the routing and the maintenance of traffic for different modes of transportation has definitely come up. I've seen it in that separate discussion. But your comment relating to development, I feel like I think that what you're talking about out on Longshore is that more private development focused, or is it capital work? Private?
It's private, but I think where I'm trying to go is this inside the comprehensive plan? So that somebody is looking both long-term, which is going to impact capital, the capital improvement plan, but near-term as well, to say, how are we thinking about development across the city? So here we have this treasure, and I think I've heard Commissioner Dish and others talk about, we didn't know that Argo Cascade was going to be as popular as it has become. So it's become this sort of southeastern Michigan gathering thing, and so that has spilled into the neighborhood, and so the neighbors weren't ready for what they call beach season, which I learned last week. So apparently we have a beach season, and we're in the midst of our comprehensive plan, but you can't get to our beach through public transportation. And if you do get there somehow on public transportation, there is no accessibility for you to get to our beach. So for me, that feels like it sits in the capital improvement plan because it's the capital built infrastructure that has to be improved to make this more accessible, equitable, and usable for our community. But I may be thinking about this incorrectly. And so you get to disabuse me of how I'm thinking about it and say, these are all great things, Donnell, but that's not my department. The 50 people come to me with their pieces. I put it all together. I give them a product and then we execute. There's somebody somewhere else. And maybe Mix Kelly can tell us, or Commissioner Dish, I don't know. But that's what's on my mind right now, especially as we're thinking about the comprehensive plan, which feeds into the capital improvement plan, because you're going to be looking at how we're planning to use land, and that impacts what things get prioritized. And so I'm just trying to, it's more like a chicken and an egg, like where does it sit? And you're the only person that comes and talks to us. So you get all my questions.
Of course, no problem. Well, I am happy to open the floor to others who may have input, particularly around the comprehensive plan, which I'm not as closely involved with. I'm on a very peripheral of it. So whether or not that's incorporated there, I think others could better respond to than me. The one last thing I'll say, and I'm happy to come back after others have spoken if that's helpful, but I do think if there are sidewalk gaps, like that's certainly, I know that you're talking about a broader issue and I'm like drilling in, but what is definitely CIP is where there are sidewalk gaps. And you mentioned along Longshore that there's frontage, and I'm searching right now in the active transportation asset group and I'm not seeing something for Longshore. I tried it with and without a space. So I'm gonna follow up on that and see, because not every sidewalk gap is in the CIP, because we're trying to make a 6-year plan and we want to make it reasonable. We don't have enough funding to put them all in 6 years. So they get filtered in progressively each year. And maybe Longshore is one that didn't rate as high through the sidewalk gap prioritization system, but maybe that prioritization system should be revisited. Anyways, that is certainly a CIP aspect. Transit accessibility is a little outside. We do have a transit asset group, but in terms of routing and scheduling, that is more of the ride, like the AATA, the ride to make those decisions. Where there are transit projects in the CIP, it's more related to transit infrastructure and not so much like scheduling and routes. But there's an opportunity there.
So just a quick clarification. So, and this is just for me to help me locate where these things go. So if I'm understanding you correctly, the idea that there is no transit, a publicly accessible transit, is outside the scope of the CIP. And so that sits in someone else's space. And so the concern that we have needs to go to that person, whether it's the transportation committee, or it's into the, or commission rather, or if it's into the comprehensive plan to say, we have these goals for reducing vehicular miles traveled in the city, but we don't have the infrastructure to make that a reality. And so who gets that is I think in my question space.
And I guess, I don't want to say push back, but like make sure we tease out, is it infrastructure or is it routing? Like,
I don't know.
Would the road support a bus route?
Yeah, if I could actually interject and let Councilmember Dish chime in real quick.
Yeah,
Thanks.
sure.
Yeah, I might have been too hasty in my words. So there is a bus that runs up Pontiac Trail. And so that's about, it would be the equivalent of maybe 3 blocks walk. I mean, to remember, Argo is in a residential neighborhood. And so, our buses don't usually snake in and around residential neighborhoods so much. They go up through fairs. So it's not inaccessible by public transportation. And I wanted to ask Mix Kelly, and I just looked this up now, the developer of Longshore is putting in sidewalks along Longshore. Are they going to, but it says the width of the project, so I'm not sure how to interpret that language of what the width of the project means, and I couldn't find a drawing where I could see better. Julie remembers this, yay.
It should be, it should be within their parcel limits. And I think the reason why that language would be there is that they're not offering to supply public sidewalk beyond their project, which is, in my estimation, reasonable and typical. I just really quick on the point about public transit, local transit stops are typically spaced about a quarter mile apart. And that would be about 4 blocks between stops. I just wanted to add that. And I'm happy to chime in with any other things that were unresolved, just push them to me.
Yeah, council member, or I'm sorry, Commissioner Weatherby.
Yeah, so I think this is just adding some to Commissioner Weiss's comment, is like Longshore, yay, they're putting in a sidewalk if that development gets built. But what that shows is like, oh, wow, now we have a big gap. And it's in some ways smaller than the gap before, but now we really see that is a problem. And I think it is very common to have this. There's several developments around me where they we required them to add a sidewalk, which is great. But now there's very obvious that there's a gap. And I don't know how those get in, like when we add sidewalk, and then that suddenly creates a gap where before it just was a street with no sidewalks, which is a gap, but I think we look specifically at parts where you can't get from A to B, and now we see those more. And also, so that's one comment, is just like, how do those new developments, is it just like marked on the plan and then goes in to say now there's a different gap, because those change every year? And I just am wondering how those sidewalk gaps are they just historical gaps and then we fill them and then it's done? Or is it that we look every year for kind of new situations?
How often how often is, like, for example, the geographic information software data updated, that type of thing?
Right, like for
survey?
Longshore, if their sidewalk is put in and then we're like, oh, wow, now there's a big gap. When does that show up? After a project is created.
I can
I have some
share-
ideas, but I'm going to defer to Caleb.
Yeah, I'll chime in and add on, please. But there is the sidewalk prioritization team that I do not sit in on their meetings. They bring information to the CIP discussion, but they're meeting, I think, throughout the year, or I mean, certainly yearly before the CIP process, to provide updates about projects that we need to add in, or that additional projects to filter into our 6-year plan. So I do think that those are getting revisited. I did want to clarify that for Longshore, what I found is it's in the Parks and Recreation asset group. I forgot that about a year ago, we moved parks sidewalk gaps that are adjacent to park property to the parks asset group, because that's how those will be funded. Those are not funded through the sidewalk millage. City property is not eligible for that millage. So the parks millage needs to fund the filling of those gaps adjacent to park property. So that's where that sits. And that would be separate. I think that I'd need to ask more about how the prioritization team is assigning each gap. I don't know if it's, because Julie, I think what you're describing is like there is a larger gap now, but once the development is built, you may notice the gap. It may stand out because there'll be a sidewalk and it'll
because
end.
you just end suddenly.
Right.
You're on a sidewalk. But
I think at least in this case, if it is the rest of Longshore is park property, which I'm not sure if there are also other private property or if it's just the development and then the park property, but the park property portion is being treated separately, it's being scored separately, because it, like, that segment of that gap is going to be funded entirely differently. Those decisions are going to be outside of the comparison of other sidewalk gaps through the prioritization model. So I don't, yeah, maybe we'll see if Mix Kelly had more to add, or any other direction to take that. But I think the teams are revisiting these gaps on a periodic basis.
Thank you. Commissioner White.
So I think you're right. I think the sidewalk on, I don't know I'm going to say on the north side of Longshore, goes to a park, and then it cuts into the park, but it doesn't go all the way down to the Cascade. And so it now makes sense, because if that's inside the parks, then it has to come that way. And then on the south side, there is no sidewalk at all. And so as Commissioner Weatherby just indicated, there will now be one, and then it will end, where the city owns the woodlands that come up from the Argo Cascades up towards Longshore. So this is helpful. I think, Mix Kelly, I just, like, I don't know who within the city apparatus, like, is this a conversation with Mr. Delacourt, where we could try to, like, if there's some time in the future, just try to understand where some of these things get raised, if not here in the capital improvements place. Because I hear the very clear answer of, there are people who are responsible for specific things. What I think is missing, if I could highlight it or daylight it, is there doesn't seem to be an overall driver. And I thought maybe the comprehensive plan would be that driver. And the comprehensive plan sits in our space, but it doesn't sound as if the comprehensive plan is that driver. And so if I'm wrong, I'm happy to be corrected. And if I'm right, I'd love to know who, if not the comprehensive plan, is the driver of how this all flows.
And a way to kind of reshape your question might be that the overall approval of the CIP is vested in this particular body, but that we're really more of a rubber stamp. So where is the actual rubber meets the road as far as kind of our input process and the weighting of enforcement of the the comprehensive plan within the purview of the CIP. So I think it's a valid point. I also think, the point about, removing duplications and or conflict points is also important, but also wanted to give Commissioner Mills a chance to speak. So Commissioner Wills.
Great. I have a bunch of disconnected notes, and I was going to end with this, but I'm actually going to start because it picks up on the comprehensive plan, but not sidewalks necessarily. But just to think, we hear multiple times that one of the limits to growth in a particular area is that the rest of the infrastructure, and actually a lot of the things in the CIP, the size of the water and wastewater infrastructure, right, is a limitation to kind of what can be affordably developed. And so to that point, I'm curious, like, again, we don't have that right now, but I wanted to plant you plant seeds. So plant the seed that, like, in the next time this comes up, I hope that we're thinking through, like, and maybe part of this prioritization going into the strategic values is, like, the extent to which one of the criteria are supporting growth in the areas that are like the comprehensive plan calls for significant growth in that particular place. I assume that that's not currently really part of the process. Is that fair?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I can't think of offhand anyway, I can't think of a scoring metric we have right now that's really assessing, like, the project's ability to support growth or development.
And it's more,
there may be coordination with other plans or other plan objectives. So like, does the project contribute to meeting one of the city's comprehensive or strategic planning document goals? Like there are broad statements like that, certainly. So you could say like, yes, the comprehensive plan says we want to support growth, and so the project does, and so it scores that way, but growth is not called out by name.
I'm just thinking that that's likely one of the, like, this is part of the regular development. And again, because there are physical infrastructure limitations to our ability to achieve the targets in the comprehensive plan. And that's current plan, not counting the plan that's underway. I just think that that's something that we should be prepared to come. And again, it can also include sidewalks, and accessibility. But I think that that's a key one. Now I'm going to go back to the beginning of my things, which is first of all to say thank you. I think I've seen a CIP presentation a lot, like many years now. This is the first, and to be real honest, how the percentages are given in the whatever it's called. Let's see.
Pairwise comparison?
Yeah, and the strategic
the
value
value.
scorecard, right? Like where those numbers come from has always been a mystery to me. And I, as a recovering engineer, like I like numbers, right? On the other hand, I know that numbers can be used to cook the books and lie, and like they can say whatever you want them to. So how that happens, and like this idea of the pairwise comparison, I don't know that I've heard that before. So thank you.
Sure.
I want to say though that like really so much, like, yes, there's lots of ways that projects can get on, and there are, I don't want to say gatekeepers, but like there can be things that are left off or missed. And similarly, like how kind of scores are assigned. But honestly, it's this numbers thing that suggests science and suggests like that I think that that's one of the things that like how things move up and down the list has been a real like black box. And I'm really happy to understand this. To understand it, but all of those things are really policy priorities. Like getting back to where Commissioner Adams started us off, like that is a policy statement about what of these values, like how much one matters more than the other. I'm curious in each of, I understand if I took your presentation right, that each of the kind of groups, asset management groups, that's the right word, like it's comprised of various individuals, but I'm curious about how diverse in terms of like functionally and like across staff those groups are. And I am going to give the university example. Like if you put, again, a bunch of engineers in a room to say, rate the priorities in terms of funding, I would imagine that they're going to come up with different things than if you put a whole bunch of social scientists together. And so this is why we try to say, like, let's make sure everybody's in the room. So I'm curious about the extent to which sustainability staff or our equity staff are in every single conversation, and how their votes count in those pairwise comparisons.
Sure. So it is meant to be very cross-departmental, interdisciplinary groups. It's not a group of engineers. Like the 50+ staff that I mentioned, the next thing I could do to throw another bubble on that slide is to add up how many different, we don't even usually call them departments, but units or service areas are involved in the process. I actually think I had a slide in the earlier presentation that showed all the puzzle pieces, and that's really showing the breadth. But I pulled up one just as an example. We have to take a look, but we've got engineering staff, we have planning staff, we have public works staff, sustainability sits on, I think, every asset group. There's at least one sustainability representative. There has not been an equity representative in the past, but the equity office, again, has only existed since 2022. And last year in 23, we were doing a plan modification, so we didn't revise those groups. This year, as we're already starting to meet with the equity team to talk about scoring, they've said they'd like to be be more involved in this process. I don't know if they're going to show up to every scoring discussion, but I bet that they will have someone on each asset group. So there are park representatives, different, stormwater management planning reps. Like it's pretty widely covered, and it's not, I think I don't know if you use the word vote or if that's just where my head went, but it is not a voting system where sustainability gets one vote for where they want the slider bar, and equity gets one vote and the engineers get one vote. It's not that scientific. It is a discussion, and I facilitate that discussion, and I have it on the screen, and I require that people come into the meeting in person, unless if we're in a heightened level of the pandemic and we truly can't. But I want to see people there. I want to know their body language and their reactions. And I try to, if people aren't speaking up from a certain area, I call that out so that we can really get a lot of voices and where that slider bar should land. So when I was talking about this recently with the equity team, and they're new to the process, so they're learning about it, and they said, okay, so it's the loudest voice wins. And I said, that's one way you could think about it, but that is truly not the goal here. And as someone who spent 12 years in community engagement before doing CIP, I really do try to facilitate that in a way where we are reaching some level of agreement or talking through it if we're not getting agreement, to find the right spot for that project to score.
Okay. And so the pairwise comparisons that you were talking about too are not each individual is doing that, and then we're averaging each individual. We are coming like as a group to like,
yeah,
which of these things is more?
Yeah.
Like, and then
Yeah.
we'll move to like A or
Talk
B.
through it. Yeah. Tell me
Right?
why
Okay.
this one is more. Tell me why that one's more.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a discussion.
That is helpful. Again, it's nice to like see behind the curtain a little bit. I'm just gonna say, like, what has been going through my mind as you were talking to is like, I'm curious how staff might come to different percentages, because that's the way I think, versus council versus planning commission, right? Like we all bring our own like different priorities, and I don't know, like if maybe collectively we all end up in the same place, but I'm sitting on that because I don't know. I'm mentioning it because I keep on thinking about it multiple times. Ultimately, at the end of the day, to the point that we do sign this, like that we agree that this is the right order, the right way to go about this. So I am so excited of redoing all of the categories and not using the same prioritization of that were decades old, in part because our how we think about good asset management, I think, has changed over time, and the values that we have as a community. And so I think that that's fantastic. I don't, in terms of the questions specifically that you had to us, other than making sure that that we might not have a specific suggestion about a category for like supporting the comprehensive plan right now. Maybe 2 years from now we do. So like, please, like maybe on the 2026, like if we can have this conversation again of what that should look like. But in terms of the questions about the metrics for sustainability or affordability or equity, I don't have anything super specific other than to say I'm really glad that we're looking at those. I think where you have like particularly, I think a lot about sustainability. And so that we have a comprehensive document that covers all different kind of things, like referencing that makes a whole lot of sense to me. And I just, again, hope that in each of these groups, like those are identified priorities that we have have come up as priorities across city policy. And so I hope that those percentages are not token, but
sure,
we'll see.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Thank you. And actually, I will, as the power to, or at least the responsibility to approve the CIP is with the Planning Commission. Just as a hypothetical question, what happens if we don't? We kick it back and say, we don't believe this aligns with the comp plan. Like what happens just procedurally? You guys go back?
I think that we would go back. I think we would get feedback from the commission on if there are specific projects that are presenting areas of concern, or we would need to get some feedback about on what basis does this feel out of alignment with our comprehensive planning documents, and make revisions and bring it back forward to the planning commission. That's my sense of the process. I haven't seen that happen. I've only been in this role for a couple of years, but I hadn't heard of it even during the time that Deb was in the role or prior to Deb. So if Mix Kelly, if you have any other input on that approval process, please feel free to weigh in.
I'm just thinking maybe it's our job to drive accountability, right, in that particular respect, so that, you know, we really dig in and say, hey, you know, I think there's portions of it that don't resonate. And obviously it needs to be an informed kind of discussion with respect to that. But I'm thinking to myself, you know, earlier I said it was a rubber stamp, but I'm like, maybe not. You know, I think it's really vested in every single person on the screen, I think, to help ensure that there's alignment. And
can anyone on the commission think of a project from past CIP last 3 years, 4 years that felt out of alignment with the comprehensive plan, the adopted master plan?
Sure. Since I'm the one, I guess, phrase that question, I suppose it's on me to come up. I don't know that I have an exact, you know, particular project, but one of the things I would mention is, for example, some of the site plans that we have approved, we often talked about making sure that the roadways kind of aligned with it. I think State and Packard was one of the intersections we identified as being really awful for you know, pedestrians, in a very confusing intersection, and or, you know, the passing of TC1, for example, and kind of the coordination of transit corridor improvements that are going to, you know, occur. Obviously, we haven't seen a project come to realization, but those are the kinds of things. Again, Ms. Kelly, my point is not to be, you know, controversial or to, I'm just playing a thought game here, so I don't have anything in particular example. So, but just wanted to say it does appear that there is a sense, you know, amongst the commission that, hey, you know, really, where can we have more active participation with respect to the CIP? You know, oftentimes people do feel like, you know, it's a process that's kind of, you know, with some gatekeepers. And so my one question, and overall, you know, what I do want to say is thank you for a great presentation. Always great to see you. We do miss you on Transportation Commission. So the categories to me seem salient and, you know, well done. Again, I think when you look at, for example, things like coordination with other projects and agencies, you know, regionalism, funding, access, mobility, so accessibility actually being already a metric. I think there's a lot of great ways that this has already been parsed out and well thought through. The sole question that I kind of come to is, what can the public do to become more involved and create, you know, again, more inclusivity and voice in the CIP process and be more effective, I suppose. So how can the public get more involved? And Commissioner Weatherby, if you wanted to add something to that, I'm happy to yield the floor to you as well. So
yeah, I think it's kind of just adding to that is also, what should we do if we notice something? Like, what's the process for us to, do we just send you an email? Do we bring it to, like, what is the process that we should do? It's just sort of an addition to what the public should do.
Sure. So in terms of the public, I would say public and commissioners being very involved in the engagement process for the comprehensive plan is really what is critical. The CIP is meant to be in alignment with that and meant to achieve our asset management planning process on a technical side. But I think that being involved in the comprehensive plans, the CIP is meant to reflect those goals. So like when we developed the Vision Zero plan and there was broad community engagement in that now the CIP, we have specific projects in there based on what was put into the Vision Zero plan, and we have scope descriptions written that reflect what that plan says. And so I think, in my opinion, it's really being involved in those comprehensive plans is what leads to CIP projects. And that's the best place for community involvement. I think if there are specific questions or concerns or feedback about the process, always reach out. My contact information is on the website a2gov.org/CIP. I would welcome to hear from any commissioners. I'd welcome any input from the public on CIP process or specific projects. We do from time to time get questions on, usually it's people are curious, I live near a sidewalk gap, when is that going to be filled? Or when will my street be resurfaced? We do get those. We respond to them with the information we have. We have to always also be very cognizant of the fact that we have limited resources and a lot of needs. So that's what is seen, I think, most often in those replies. And that can be frustrating to hear for people that may live on a street with poor pavement condition, as most residents in Ann Arbor probably do. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. It's not truly poor by the asset condition interpretation, but there's a lot. My point is just that there's a lot of needs and there's only limited resources. So we have to temper that expectation, but feedback and questions are all welcome. If there's any other, Mix Kelly, if you have guidance on how planning commissioners, if you prefer to streamline communications any other way, if you'd like them through you, that's fine with me too, but it doesn't bother me to get direct emails.
I mean, it doesn't have to be either or. That's the great thing about email. But there were a few things that were brought up during the meeting that I'm thinking about. One is that how do members of the public and how would the commission have access to the backlog of projects that were scored but not high enough to be included in a 6-year time horizon, or a time horizon that would be visible in the CIP. Some of what we work through with staff are just presenting information, limitations of tools that we have. Kayla migrated to a new platform and scoring methodology that's been ramping up over time. It's called Alavans. We have some really smart people who are helping us with developing and diving into adjusting our scoring criteria so that they encompass all of the things that were brought up today. What's the name of the group that's at the university that is working with our consultant, Kayla?
Is it the thing about economic development is where
but they're basically consultants that help public sector.
The Economic Growth Institute is with the University of Michigan Economic Growth Institute. We have a couple of representatives from that group that work with Alavance, and that's who we're contracting with to help us through these scoring update process.
Thanks. So, some of the things just to, the purpose of this meeting was exactly what Commissioner Mills said, was to give more insight into behind the curtain, and for you to tell us, I still can't see this. It's still not visible to me. So, I think that probably the Transportation Commission has received detailed presentations on the sidewalk gap program, the funding, the prioritization that is within that maybe this commission hasn't been privy to. We could look at finding where those materials are and forwarding them so that it's apparent where they exist. I know that a presentation of this kind has to exist, but for some reason it has not been connected back into this group. A lot of projects from you, or a lot of questions from you all about sidewalks. So that's clearly something that you're interested in, that you want to know. You want to know, how often is it updated? How are they scored? Oh, some are in parks. Like, just tell me. I want to know. So I hear that definitely, and we can try to dig up where those materials are. And then also I can just brainstorm with Kayla, like, how do we share with the public the projects that didn't score high enough to be included? We have a public facing map. If you go to a2gov.org/CIP, I reference it all the time, but that only shows you the projects that have been scored. It does tell you the project score. If you're curious, there is information about the project scoring generally on the website, but it needs to be maybe people just want even more transparency. So how can we build that systematically into a tool that's within the capacity of staff to deliver? Those are great challenges for us. In terms of some of the content about who is thinking about growth, we are talking about growth explicitly and how to accommodate it within the CIP process through the sustainability and equity scoring criteria discussions. That's one of the ways that we want to look at how we measure opportunity. And it's challenging. It's challenging to develop these things in a way that is applicable across all asset groups. There's a lot of different types of projects. Some projects are just maintenance projects, and we have to really drill down to figure out which categories do we exclude because they're not applicable, and which categories are we most trying to target and influence. Do those have dollar value thresholds associated with them beyond what it already takes to get into the CIP, which I understand is $100,000. So there's a lot that we are considering. We are considering the alignment with our existing canon of plans. One of the things with the current comp plan update is that it's meant to better align and explicitly incorporate content from the Parks and Recreation Open Space Plan, PROS Plan, the Treeline Allen Creek Urban Trail Master Plan, and the Moving Together Towards Vision Zero Plan, while phasing out 5 other plans. So we don't have that yet, though. We will not have that for this fall, which means that we have to do our best, as you all are doing your best at the planning table, and as council is doing their best to accommodate growth and recommend what we think is in policy alignment with the city, with a lot of other constraints. It would be really, really convenient if we had a plan to end all plans. I've never worked in a community where this was the case, and I don't think even with the new comprehensive plan in Ann Arbor that we will have a single source of truth. That's part of the art and less of the science of this process, is that development plans, as some have noted, are not always in sync with our 5-year planning efforts. We don't even know sometimes the week before we get something in stream that we're going to be asked to consider a new development. There are a lot of competing timelines, which makes it interesting, and it also makes it really hard. But we are doing our best, and I can say that all of the things that were raised are things that staff are thinking about, and not thinking about on a cursory level, but thinking about in hours and hours and hours of meetings in a really, really thoughtful way, trying to do our best. There's not currently a long-range division within our planning department. There used to be. As you know, we're growing staff. We have 2 new planners who are going to be added next week. Maybe that has the potential to grow in the future. But right now, it's definitely been a little bit of a twister game to try to take on all of the ordinance amendments and other special projects. And I think that this would fall, somewhat in a similar category and I am attending a lot of the CIP meetings. Kayla, I don't know how many, but I've seen, I think every day I get a new calendar invite. I'm like, oh, that asset group, that's interesting. So in terms of, is there a planning voice represented at the table? Are we looking at alignment from a holistic lens from that discipline and from the discipline that's important to the Planning Commission? I think we are doing our absolute best. And from what I've seen, I see a really thoughtful process that will get even better once we have a new comprehensive plan.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I know you guys are, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're very, very grateful to have such a great staff of professionals. And I know that it's not just, the things we can see like, sidewalks, but it's stormwater, it's wastewater treatment. It's a lot of very, when we talk about growth, it's not just utilities, but a lot of things underground that we can't see that require a lot of money and time and planning. So and even being able to do this while we recognize you're understaffed, and so we really appreciate everything, and we're very extremely grateful. So and then Commissioner Weatherby, final comment before we.
Yep. I just, this conversation triggered a memory for me, and I realized that there is a really awesome sidewalk gap page map online that if you just search like City of Ann Arbor sidewalk gaps map, there's a really awesome thing of where the sidewalk gaps are and when they were fixed and when they're, now I don't know if that's still, it looks like the last data was 2023, but nonetheless, still awesome, still out there. And it just reminded me that that does exist.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you. Thank you again. Kayla, Ms. Coleman, thank you so much for coming and speaking with us and giving us all kind of an insight into the hood of how, under the hood of how everything's going happening. So any other thoughts that you had on your end? Final words from you.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure. I love the discussion. There's lots that I learn from each of you every time that I join one of these meetings. There's lots that I learn on things I want to follow up on and get more information from other staff and continue to grow my knowledge in this area as well. So it's really a pleasure. I think that the work we're doing now is going to improve that scoring process, and but there will always be more work left to do. We'll have, as Mix Kelly was saying, that the comprehensive plan, it won't be ready for this fall. So maybe we revisit again in a couple of years, and we can keep growing this process and making it better. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. All right, with that, we're moving on to communications, of which there are none, and then we open up for final public comment. Do we have anybody here that would like to, we have 4 attendees here. Would anyone like to speak at public comment? A few more seconds. With that, I'll close public comments and we are headed to the final item of the agenda, which is adjournment. Do I have any objections? Without objections, have a great night, everyone. Thank you again so much, Kayla. Have a good night.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you.